To discuss all this and more. And in the studio, we have Ian King, the financial broadcaster. Welcome, good to see you. And we also have Chris Caldwell, who's CEO of United Renewables. Welcome. And we also have Stephen Chan, who's Professor of World Politics at SOAS, University of London. Good to see you, Stephen. And then in Berlin, we have Thomas O'Donnell, an energy and geopolitics strategist. Welcome to the programme, Thomas. Good to see you all. Great to be having this conversation about the oil situation. And Ian, we saw the price shoot up, it fell back again, just enormously volatile, isn't it? Talk us through what happened.
Well, I think sentiment is driving markets now to a great extent. We saw earlier in the week this comment from Donald Trump that the war would be over soon. And you got a bit of a relief rally in equities and bonds and other financial instruments at that time. And crucially, obviously, the oil price came off, but it's back above $90 a barrel now. I mean, these are pretty elevated levels, given that prior to the hostilities breaking out, crude was bobbling around at sort of $66, $67 a barrel. So this is a big, appreciable increase. And
at one point, we saw it shoot up to 190 and almost 120.
Yeah, very, very. I mean, that was overnight on Sunday. It came off again pretty rapidly thereafter, mainly because there was a story in the Financial Times that the International Energy Agency was going to start breaking into its stockpile. And that gave people some comfort, market participants some comfort. The IEA's only done this 5 times in its entire 52-year history. So that is quite a dramatic move. Probably the bigger concern is actually the way that the gas price has been moving, because whilst oil has risen by some sort of 27% across the piece, the price of gas is up 50%. So that's really a very significant increase indeed. And that's obviously going to cause a lot of pain to a lot of economies.
Well, let's talk about that IEA decision, perhaps, on releasing those oil reserves. Thomas, that would potentially be the biggest release in their history. What kind of difference could that make?
Well, I essentially agree with what Ian has said. It's basically to reassure the markets. Look, Fatih Birol made it very clear last Friday, and also Chris Wright, the Secretary of Energy in the United States, there's plenty of oil in the market. And I have to say, I could explain, there's so much extra oil. There was 1.4 billion barrels floating on the water, which is a huge amount. So there's no real need to put oil in the market. This was the optimal time if somebody wanted to attack Iran. But I think what happened is panic when the market opened, it spiked. And there's been some reassurance from the White House. The president isn't so good at sticking on cue, but Chris Wright and others have made pretty clear that there's plenty of oil available. And the price every morning on Tuesday and Wednesday morning, the price was coming down. And I think by just announcing that the IEA might put this oil back on the market, it reassures everybody.
So, Chris, do you think that the energy markets are perhaps overreacting based on what Thomas was saying there?
No, actually, I don't. I think that we're in a period of tremendous uncertainty. Like even if we saw over, we obviously we had the spike on Sunday and then Monday, and we've also had some movements more recently on the basis of the U.S. Energy Secretary coming out and saying that we have successfully escorted a ship through the Strait of Hormuz, and then you have the Department of Defense coming out and saying that we haven't had more spikes up and down. The issue comes about 20% of the world's oil supply goes through the Strait of Hormuz. This is something that is very easily, it's only 21 miles across at its narrowest point. So it's very vulnerable to drone attacks. The US is talking about potentially escorting ships through. That's a very expensive thing to do. Insurance companies are saying that we're not happy with backing ships moving through. So essentially ships are parked both sides of this strait. Anything that can be done to try and free that up is a very expensive thing to do. So ultimately, if this conflict keeps on moving, you're going to have 20% of the world's oil supply stranded. And yes, there is a lot of excess in the market, but 20% is an awful lot to try and replace. So the longer this goes on, the more uncertainties in there, and the more difficulties that we end up running into.
So, Stephen, as Chris was saying there, around 20% of the world's oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz. Who is most affected by this in terms of oil supply? China, for one, gets a large proportion of their oil from Iran. Who's affected? Is it most affected? Is it China?
China, certainly, but many of the emerging countries in Africa, for instance, will be very affected by this, dependent on oil imports. And as for China, before the war, some 15% of its oil was sourced from Iran. And if you add in the Gulf states, almost a quarter of their supplies came from the area affected by war. So the Chinese are very, very worried. They're not panicking. They've got some reserves. They've been very prudent. But they're worried about the long-term aspects of all of this.
So, Thomas, the Straits of Hormuz, obviously a pinch point, a flashpoint in this conflict at this stage. But what about the reason for it in the first place? Is some of the reason for this conflict that the United States actually wants to control the oil that Iran has?
I'm going to tell you about that, but let me just object a little bit to what Chris was saying there. 20 million barrels comes out of the Gulf. However, the Saudis can pump about let's say 6 million barrels through their pipeline that avoids it. The UAE about 1.5, and the Americans are letting the Iranians keep sending their oil out. Why not? So that cuts it down to about 11 million barrels a day. The strategic reserves are about 1.8 when you consider commercial stocks, 2 billion barrels. That's something like 160 days worth of oil if you need to make up 11. Now you have to get it around the right place. There's no fundamental problem, but that's another issue. Now, why the United States is doing this exactly, I have to say, I just put it this way. Because of the war in Ukraine, the United States, in their energy dominance strategy under Trump, the United States is by far the biggest producer of oil and gas in the world. He wants to use it. He started to use it against Russia, preparing to take Russian barrels offline systematically. But he stopped. Although there's plenty of oil in the market to replace Russia right now, if they do this, they wanted to get Venezuela online because longer term that can easily replace Russia. And I think they wanted to solve the problem with Iran, various things, their missile program especially. But 5.4 million barrels a day of Chinese oil comes out of the Gulf, okay? And once the United States controls Hormuz, they'll be the arbiter of whether China and how China receives that. And if they make a deal with Iran and develop their oil sector, they will have America and its allies will have 60% of the world's production under essentially under Washington's hegemony. And that's considerable power over China. And in the end, I think that's what Trump's interest is here.
So, Stephen, I want to come to you. How is China reacting to this then? Some people perhaps expecting them to back Iran, but how is China responding to what's happened?
Basically, the Chinese are not totally certain how to respond. They certainly fear what was just said, that you've got the likelihood or possibility of American control over the oil in the Gulf area. And they don't like that because they can't find any predictability in American foreign policy right now. Their strategists can't read what America is hoping or wanting to do and how to do it. And they're very, very mindful because they sourced a bit of their oil from Venezuela as well. Not much, but some. But they're very, very mindful of the unpredictability of current American foreign policy and the fact they could strike anywhere. And the Chinese have got interests around the world. They behave like their vocation is truly as a superpower, but they don't have the military muscle that can be projected like the USA can. And so President Xi is looking at a whole number of issues, not just sustainability of his oil supplies, but about a much longer-term future in which does he have enough military throw weight to act as a deterrent to unpredictable United States policy.
Well, all of this clearly adds up to a lot of geopolitical uncertainty, volatility, high prices, and this could have a broader effect than just the high oil price, couldn't it, economically, potentially around the world?
Absolutely, and you're already seeing that. It's obviously a higher oil price, a higher gas price. I mean, that is effectively a tax on growth. It's very, very inflationary, albeit not to the extent that it once was. I mean, if you cast your mind back to the setting up of the IEA's reserve in the 70s, that was a direct result of the Yom Kippur War, which basically put the developed world into recession and clouded the whole of the late 1970s, really. You had elevated levels of inflation. There's a threat that you're seeing that again now because as I say, not to the extent that it was, because the world is less carbon intense global GDP is less carbon intense than once it was. We're not as exposed to jumps in the oil and gas prices we were in the 1970s, partly because of renewables, partly because, if you take a country like France, 70% of their energy comes from nuclear, so they're absolutely fine. But it still feeds into higher food prices, fertilizer prices, manufacturing. If you look, for example, at why, say, the German stock market has fallen by more than the UK stock market, it's because Germany has manufacturing is a bigger proportion of GDP. So you have more energy intense usage over there. So that's a factor for them. But you're seeing it, for example, in the way that bond prices are reacting. Before all this started, everyone was assuming that the Bank of England would cut interest rates a couple of times this year. Probably the Federal Reserve would go at least once. You're now getting markets pricing in no rate cuts from the Bank of England or the Fed. The ECB, the European Central Bank, the markets are now even pricing in rate rises there. And that's all because of inflation, and that's all because of these higher energy prices.
Well, Thomas, I want to come to you because the idea of an international market throws up the question of Russia, which you mentioned. Russia has said that it's ready to work again with European customers to put its oil back into the market. And the Trump administration has said that it may reduce oil sanctions on countries, including Russia. How might that shake things up?
Look, essentially, the United States and Ukraine together had a joint campaign since about last April. There's the drone strikes, which are coordinated by the American intelligence and logistics. We're hitting refineries, forcing the Russians to export more oil. However, they've only got three westward-facing ports that can really get much of this out. The Ukrainians were hitting the biggest one. So they have a problem. The oil starts to get backed up, and the ports are at 100%. And then what happened is Trump cut off India, and they only had China left. In the last 2 or 3 months, the Russians put 50% more oil on the water, essentially oil that has no place to go. And it was almost at the point where they're going to have to turn off fields in West Siberia in winter, and you'll probably never get them back online. In which it would be a mess. They're very old fields. This is something hanging over Putin. Now he's getting a reprieve because Trump wants to do something with Iran, and he's letting him sell oil. So it's kind of counterproductive. He'll sell oil to India, take care of India, while Trump finishes with Iran. When he's done with Iran, he'll turn back to Russia and finish the project with Russia. And I would just say very quickly, the other thing, the interest in the Straits of Hormuz, you have to take Xi Jinping seriously. And I think Biden and Trump both took him seriously when he said, be prepared by 2027 to take back Taiwan. So they take him seriously. If there is a war, we know that the American Navy would cut off the oil to China. China's been putting 1 million barrels a day underground for well over a year. On the other hand, China could have Iran close the Straits of Hormuz, and all our allies in the Pacific who get their oil from there, Japan, Korea, so forth, would be in trouble. And the Americans would have to divert a couple aircraft carriers during a war to reopen it. So I think if that's how the Americans are thinking, they'll do whatever it takes to reopen and have complete control of Hormuz now. It's the kind of thing great powers do when they think a major conflict might be coming.
So the Straits of Hormuz at the moment are virtually impassable. But for Iran, Stephen, how important is it to keep on getting oil out, especially at a moment which it's already damaged? The economy needs that money coming in.
They need that money coming in. They're quite determined to keep fighting this war, even though they've got less and less capacity to fight it effectively. They're certainly attacking allies of the West in the Gulf area. They've got no other real strategy except to try to attack Western economic interests because they can't match the West militarily. So for the Iranians, they've got an end game in mind, which is driving the Americans to a bargaining table in which some of their terms can be realistically met. But the Iranians are very, very much worried that they will be deposed as a player on the world scene, and they want to remain as a player on the world scene. And this is actually something which has received much more support than the Americans would have thought. In other words, the idea of having some kind of power base that is not Western in the Middle East, even if they're not very sympathetic power base, that still appeals to a number of Middle Eastern countries and governments.
So we've talked a bit about the geopolitics of this, but what about how this is going to affect real people? I mean, Ian, we are, all of us perhaps, going to see the effects of this in our own pockets.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said earlier, higher energy prices are a tax on growth effectively. They will eat into disposable incomes. Now, in some countries, I think it probably affects the Americans more than it does the Europeans in this extent, because if you take the price of motor fuel, that's quite heavily taxed in Europe. You know, in the UK, practically sort of 65, 70% of what you pay at the pumps is in taxes, similar in a lot of European countries. In America, it's much more lightly taxed, so the price is a good deal more responsive to the wholesale price and to what's going on global markets. And you've already seen that. And I think Europeans don't really get the importance that American consumers place on this. The price of filling up at the pumps is absolutely huge for them. So Trump will have the midterms in mind. Anything that eats into Americans' disposable income is going to be bad news for him, which is why he wants this over with quickly.
Well, Thomas, I want to come to you on that because you've worked in Washington, haven't you? And as Ian says, this won't play well for President Trump. Also, this could potentially be a squeeze on fertilizer, which also comes through the Strait of Hormuz. Not good for farmers, possible Trump voters.
No, I agree. Ian's making some good points. This can have a lot of effects if it goes on. And war, you know, the other side gets a vote in a war. This is something the Americans have gamed out for 40 years. And I think Trump is portraying it a little bit differently than it was before. If you go back to Dick Cheney, you go back to, you know, those years, they talked about if Iran didn't behave, okay, tried to develop a nuclear weapon, or now this rocketry, which in a sense is as effective, that they would bomb them back to the Stone Age. That's what he used to say. And the campaign would essentially be, you know, B-52s bombing and bombing and bombing. Now, Trump says, I want to make a deal. But he started the same program. This program is, if you listen to any of the ex-admirals for the area, General Petraeus, Pete Hegseth, even a Secretary of War, or John Bolton, this is a campaign that's going to go on for weeks. The Iranians could, quote, surrender, make a deal, but if they don't, it'll go on. And all those people I mentioned, I've heard them say once or twice, will it go on? Well, the B-2 bombers and the B-52s have just begun to arrive. So it's that they would try to completely devastate the industrial base, the basis for Iran to make missiles and to control the Straits of Hormuz. And as I said earlier, my impression is they feel this is necessary because of the challenge China might pose. They want to secure this area and also secure control over half of China's oil. It's not a pretty picture, but it's real politics. Things like this happened before World War II also.
So, Chris, I wonder if this raises again the idea of energy sovereignty. At this point, our country is thinking, you know what, I'd be better off if I could provide my own energy needs rather than having to rely on these complex relationships, supply chains, to get what I need.
Yes and no. A lot of the security that came from within the European Union post the Russia's invasion of Ukraine came from having very, very elaborate supply chains. So they were able to trade in one route for another. There was a cost, but it was the interdependence that created that independence, the ability to break through that. But in terms of talking about trying to weaken China. Actually, I think we're moving towards a position where countries will be looking to try and reduce dependence upon oil and gas, moving towards renewables. And what country produces all of the technology? What country produces the solar panels, the extremely light, cheap batteries? That's China. So, in one sense, taking away, trying to control some of the oil and gas will be having one impact. But on the other side, you're creating a very large dependence from other countries, particularly the developing countries, to moving away from oil and gas and moving them towards China. So, it isn't a zero-sum game here. Yeah.
And Thomas, we should perhaps touch on the fact that the particular kind of oil produced in Iran is, let's call it a premium product, if you like. It's very adaptable, isn't it? And actually not all countries make that kind of oil.
No, you're right. I think the American intention is if they make a deal or somehow get control of Iran in the way, or there's a revolution in the way that they have in Venezuela, they will be able to develop Iran's oil much more rapidly. You know, you can produce the oil there for $10, $15, $20 a barrel, and it's a bit more expensive in Venezuela, a bit more high-tech things involved. Let me just point out, along the lines of what Chris is saying, I sympathize. It'd be great if we could do this. In the world today, almost every single country, with a couple exceptions, between 90 and 93% of everything that moves in the country is fueled by 60% of the world's oil. The rest goes to other things. China has had a very elaborate energy security program. Let me just say they learned from Japan in World War II when FDR cut off the oil and that kind of thing. And they've had a 25 or more year project to, first of all, get its companies out there, acquire oil, to try and avoid the Straits of Malacca by making pipelines around to other ports and bringing pipelines in from, getting oil from Russia that's harder to block some. They've got all this, and by developing electric cars very aggressively. So they're down below 90%, but they're abjectly dependent on oil. If there's a conflict, if they try to take Taiwan or some other test, their oil will be cut off. And so I'm sure Mr. Trump and Mr. Xi will be talking about that in about a month.
So as this continues, still uncertain, Thomas, we're talking about a possible plan from the United States, but we don't know clearly what that is. What's the outlook, do you think, Ian? Are we going to see those record high oil prices that we saw back in 2008?
We'll go back to what Thomas was saying, which is that before all this started, the world was awash with oil. And the really big developments over the last decade has been the fact that the US has supplanted Saudi Arabia as being the world's biggest oil exporter. The Saudis are no longer the swing producer, and accordingly, you're seeing them trying to diversify their economy accordingly. So, and there are plenty of supplies. I mean, China, I think, is sitting on 140 days worth of supplies. It can fuel itself domestically just from its reserves. The US and Japan, I think, have got something like 700 million barrels between them. So there is a lot of oil in reserve. That ought to provide some comfort. But ultimately, you want this over with quickly, because if this does become protracted, it is going to hit growth. You're already seeing it in terms of some of the business surveys that are being published. It's already having a depressing effect on business investment and sentiment, and that's not good, ultimately.
Stephen, what do you think? Is just an end to this the thing that will settle markets down?
Yes, I think that would settle markets down, although the markets will remain nervous in case things get inflamed again. Certainly the Chinese would like things to settle down. Very, very great virtue in terms of all Chinese policy is predictability, and for that you need stability. There's almost a very Confucian desire to have that kind of stability. And President Xi has got quite a number of problems at home. These purges of his military, for instance, show that he is not particularly happy with his own stability. So he needs to have an international environment which is stable. He needs to have a president of the United States he can talk to and rely upon. He doesn't feel he's got that right now. So everyone would like to have some kind of stable platform to look at the future from.
Bear in mind, government finances are pretty stretched everywhere. If you cast your mind back to 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, governments like the UK subsidised household energy bills. That was an enormous expense to the Treasury at the time, and they don't have the ability to do that anymore. Debt to GDP ratio's risen since then here in the UK. Probably of the G7 countries, only Germany is in any sort of position to subsidise consumer bills.
Okay, gentlemen, it was great to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining this conversation here on Roundtable. Chris Caldwell from United Renewables, Thomas O'Donnell, energy and geopolitics strategist, financial journalist Ian King, and Professor Stephen Chan from SOAS, University of London.